Hello there! Since I used to work with slower CPU-based render engines like Corona or V-Ray, and now I've switched to faster ones like Blender Cycles and Unreal Engine, which I'm using both in my projects now, I became curious about how these two engines compare when it comes to speed versus quality. Obviously, real-time rendering in Unreal Engine is going to be way faster than Blender, but the real question is, are we really sacrificing quality that much for that speed? To find out, I've prepared 3 different scenes and I'll render each one in both engines so we can compare the results side by side. For example, the first scene is a detailed full CGI environment packed with small objects like greenery and autumn leaves and shot from shaded area. The second scene has a much simpler environment and lighting setup, but this time we'll be focusing on fur rendering, with a close-up of a photorealistic cat and its fur. And finally, the third scene is a typical product animation rendered under sharp studio lighting. There is 2 important notes before we begin. First, I won't be using path tracing in Unreal Engine for this comparison. Since it's essentially the same rendering method as Cycles, the results and render time are nearly identical, so we'll be focusing entirely on the Lumen render. Second, to make comparison more balanced, I decided not to use any plugins such as Ultra Dynamic Sky for Unreal Engine, for example. So in both engines, I'll be using identical light sources with almost identical settings. There will be no volumetric materials and fog when Unreal has a clear speed advantage, and no large greenery areas either. In other words, I've slightly cut back on some of Unreal's strong sides, which naturally affected the appearance of some renders from that engine. Keep in mind though, Unreal is very flexible and its render time almost not increases as the scene gets heavier. On the other hand, Unreal also has its own weak sides, and we'll see some of those in this comparison later. Alright, enough talk, let's take a closer look at each scene and compare the render results. So the first scene in our comparison will be this demo scene from polyheaven.com that contains almost 4 million faces and light up with the HD RAM up and some additional fake lights. So here we are, it's the Cycles render in Blender. It's the viewport shading mode pre-render, so we can use the approximate results of our render, and some things we should have paying attention to. It's for example, this glass shader that will be a bit tricky to imitate in Unreal Engine. So here we are. Here's the scene in Blender. So let's take a look on it in Unreal Engine. So here we are in Unreal Engine. We have the same scene from Blender transferred using USD workflow with the default lighting setup. But as you can see, it looks a bit different. So the lights are different, the colors are different, and the shadows are different. But it's completely real time. You could make any changes you like here just in place, without waiting the render to calculate the shadows, the reflections, and that stuff. It's the whole scene in real time, like as a game or something like this, because it's the game engine. So first of all, I'd like to mention that the point of the video is to compare the default settings in Unreal to default settings in Blender. So you could always make more natural look here with the lights in Unreal Engine, but now I'm not going to it, I'm just using the default settings. So that's the reason our greenery could be a bit overlighted by the sun and that stuff. So let's take a closer look on our glass shader. Please keep in mind that the glass shaders in Unreal Engine, it's the painful zone. So anytime you'd like to transfer your glass shaders from any other softwares using CPU renders, such as Cycles or V-Ray or Corona, you'd experience some problems with the glass shaders, and you should every time recreate it manually to make a proper look. But as you can see, it's way more different from what we had in Blender before, but it is what it is. I'll just leave it this way, so let's jump into our render results. Here's the second scene of our comparison. It's the Blender Cycles as well, with the open image denoiser and 6.5 million faces. We got here the extremely high poly building with the 1.5 million faces, the tram and the HDRI lighting only. And the most important thing here that we're gonna compare is the hair groom, the cat's fur here. It's how it looks in Blender. And we're gonna compare it with the hair groom system in an Unreal Engine. Let's jump into the real-time render right now. So here we have the same scene in Unreal Engine. Now it's real-time. And yeah, as you can see, I didn't really care about this glass windows because we don't need it in our camera. So let's see our fur here, and yeah, here it is. Here we are. It looks a bit weird and totally different from the Blender, but it's still really possible to transfer the hair fur from Blender to Unreal, and this cat's groom looks okay in Unreal Engine, but let's see it in the final results. So that's our last scene in Blender with the studio lighting setup and SSD disk with its animation of splitting up and combining back together, rendered in cycles as usual, GPU compute, motion blur, without denoiser. But it's the type of scene where Unreal Engine really shines with its real-time rendering. So let's jump into it. So now we are in Unreal Engine and we have this scene looks like that. And let's switch to the camera here. And yes, here we are. Here is our motion. Here we could make any changes and stuff literally immediately. So let's compare it in our render results, but please just keep in mind that in Unreal Engine we have the frame rendering in, let's say, 2 seconds against approximately 30 seconds in Blender.